This is Duke University.
Thanks everybody on this cold, windy day for coming out. I'm Linda Martin. I'm a litigation partner here at Simpson Thacher, a Duke Law grad of '96, and one of the past co-chairs of Duke New York, which is an umbrella organization that brings together all of our various Duke alumni network groups here in New York. And we've really had great success doing a lot of events, and just the attendance at this event, we've had just a lot of fun pulling together lively conversations, and we expect this will be more of the same. We have a wonderful panel of experts on the topic of guns in America. What we have really tried to do is balance our liberal and conservative voices. It's been an important point for us in planning it, and I can tell from the inquiries we've gotten also for the audience. So we really, unfortunately, are missing one of our liberal speakers, but Professor Cook was not able to come up from the Sanford School. With the wind that we've got here in LaGuardia, he was stuck in at Raleigh-Durham. There are no flights that are really landing here. So we have, though, four great speakers here with us. Our first speaker here is Professor Schrader, Charles S. Murphy, Professor of Law and Public Policy Studies at Duke Law School. Professor Schrader is going to serve as our moderator for the panel. He returned to the law school in December 2012 after serving for nearly 3 years as the Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy in the United States Department of Justice. And while he was there, following the March 2011 shooting of then Representative Gabby Giffords in Arizona, he worked with the Criminal Division and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives on recommendations for reducing gun violence. And as part of this process, he and other officials met with police chiefs, gun control advocates, firearms dealers, and officials who operate the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System to help develop those recommendations. So he really has developed a lot of background knowledge through that and other work he has done on this topic. He also has academic interests in environmental law and policy, risk regulation, tort theory, con law, admin law, and congressional procedures and affairs. And there's a much longer bio. I'm not reading everything that's in the pamphlet you have in front of you, but those are some of his focuses. He's written a number of case books, including Environmental Regulation, Law, Science, and Policy, and Keeping Faith with the Constitution, as a co-author, and he's currently working on a book on presidential power, as well as a series of articles on surveillance and information policy. And we're thrilled to have you here. We also have Professor Schrader. I always have to do a plug when we have one of our deans, but his wife, Dean Bartlett from the law school. Thank you for joining us, Kate. Next, I'm going alphabetically here. We have Liz Avor, who is a 2006 graduate of Duke Law School. And Liz is senior counsel at Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which is a national bipartisan coalition of mayors and grassroots supporters who are working to help keep our communities safer by passing some common sense gun legislation and working hard to keep guns out of dangerous hands. And it's a coalition of Republicans, Democrats, independents with mayors from 43 states. So it really is all political perspectives in a really broad swath of the United States. This provides technical assistance there to the federal government and to state and local governments who are looking to reduce gun violence in their communities. Before that, she served as an Assistant Attorney General of the island nation of Palau. And I don't know if there's much gun violence you deal with in Palau, so I'm not sure that really added to the expertise, but I'm fascinated and wish I had time. Before that, she followed a more typical career, was an associate at the law firm of Greenberg Traurig here in New York. From NYU, we want to thank Professor Jim Jacobs, just here to my left. Professor Jacobs joined the faculty of NYU in 1982. He came there from Cornell, and he's the Warren E. Berger Professor of Law in the Center for Research in Crime and Justice. He teaches first-year criminal law, upper-year electives on criminal procedure, federal criminal law, and juvenile justice, and specialized electives on topics which include gun control and the privatization of criminal justice. He was named a 2012 Guggenheim Fellow in recognition and support of his research on jurisprudential and policy issues related to criminal records. Professor Jacobs has published 15 books, including Can Gun Control Work? And I think you'll find that he's maybe not the biggest supporter of whether it will actually work. But we'll hear Professor Jacobs speak on that. He's written more than 100 articles on different topics, which include gun control and also prisons, imprisonment, organized crime, and diverse criminal record-related issues. He co-authored an article in 2011, Keeping Firearms Out of the Hands of the Dangerously Mentally Ill. And I think just as that was going to press, the Arizona shooting of Representative Giffords happened. So a very timely article when he came out with that. His most recent book is Breaking the Devil's Pact, The Battle to Free the Teamsters from the Mob, which is a case study of the 22-year-long civil RICO litigation where they tried to purge the Teamsters Union of the influence and exploitation of organized crime. So tremendous background in this area. And our last expert from Fordham, Professor Nick Johnson. Professor Johnson is professor of law at Fordham, which he joined in 1993 after working in private practice at a couple of different law firms, including as counsel at Kirkpatrick and Lockhart. He was a principal and general counsel to Westar Environmental Corporation, then became professor of legal studies and business at Franklin and Marshall before joining the Fordham faculty. He teaches and has written a number of scholarly articles in the fields of contracts, the UCC, environmental law, but also gun regulation and federalism. He has 2 books on that topic, Negroes and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms, and then Firearms Law and the Second Amendment, Regulation, Rights, and Policy. And there's more than a dozen law review articles that he's written on the topics of firearms regulation and the Second Amendment, which are detailed in the pamphlet you've got. So I want to thank our esteemed panelists. You can see they all have tremendous background in the area. We're going to start with Professor Schrader leading a panel discussion, and then we'll open this up to a Q&A that involves the audience. So we invite you to collect your questions and get ready to engage in a great discussion. When this is done, we will be moving to an attorney lounge we have at the end of the hall for a reception, which everyone is invited to. Professor Schrader.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thanks everybody for coming out this evening. We do want to allow time for questions, so we're going to try to be as succinct as we can at the introductory part, but we did think it was worthwhile to have a panel discussion first on a number of topics that have been in the news recently. As I'm sure you're all aware, this is an incredibly polarized topic of conversation. After the tragedy in Sandy Hook, there was a great deal of, it ignited another round of intense conversation and dialogue throughout the country, and a good deal of effort spent in the United States Congress in the attempt to work out some bipartisan legislation that might ameliorate some of the excessive gun violence that we experience. That effort didn't succeed. In April of last year, the bill that Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, Republican and Democrat, had worked together to try to build a bipartisan vote, failed in the Senate to get the 60 votes needed to end debate. And since that time, there hasn't been much movement at the federal level, and I think given the season we're in, we're unlikely to see active legislation at the federal level, at least until after the 2014 elections at a minimum. At the state level, it's a rather different story. The New York Times ran a 1 year after story on December 14th of 2013 and tracked 109 pieces of legislation that had been enacted at the state level and identified another 70 that had passed at least one house in a variety of states. So there's been more activity at the state level. It's safe to say this is still a topic that is an active topic of conversation with a great deal of disagreement in all of those assemblies and state houses over what the right approaches are. In putting together the panel, we wanted to try to steer us initially to areas that we might discuss where hopefully the conversation is a little bit less polarized than others. not that there's going to be unanimity, but let's see if we could talk about some topics in which maybe we can have some, as I say, less polarized conversation. So that's where we're going to start, and then throw it open to you, and you can take us deep into the politics of polarization if you want to, or any other place. But first let me briefly, and here I'm going to channel Phil Cook a little bit, who regrets not being here, and I'm sure regrets being stuck on the tarmac at Raleigh-Durham for as long as he was. But he was going to set the stage a little bit to just give a little bit more granularity to this problem of gun violence, because it's really consists of a number of different issues, not all of which lend themselves to the same kinds of approaches or analyses. So just to give you a little bit of a more granular view, 2010 is the latest national figures I was able to find from the Center for Disease Control, keeps these numbers. Roughly 31,000 deaths by gunshot in the United States, 19,000 or so of those suicides, 600 accidental shootings, and the rest homicides. Now the good news about that is that gun violence is down about 50% from 1991 levels on a per capita basis. All crime is down by about 50% since 1991, and gun violence crime is more or less consistent with that kind of trend. So if you want to tell a good side of this story, we're now experiencing gun violence at about the rate that we experienced in the 1950s, the quiet 1950s, when Leave It to Beaver and such shows were the norm. We then spiked up after that through the 60s and into the 90s, and have now been slowly declining. That said, it's still the case that in the last 30 years, over 1 million people, 1 million Americans, have died from gunshot wounds in the United States, and that's about the same number as have died in all of the wars that the United States has fought in its lifetime. So suicides, just let me talk a little bit about those. That rate actually hasn't gone down. It's about the same as it hasn't experienced the same trend that I've noticed with respect to criminal homicides. And in fact, it's even spiked a little bit since 2007, and there's some social science suggestion that the Great Recession has played a role in that. About 1 in 5 of the homicide victims are women, and about 1 in 5 of the suicide victims are also women. Victimization rates generally much higher in the African American community than in the non-Hispanic white community by a factor of about 16. The victimization of males from gun violence, non-suicide gun violence, tends to be associated with altercations, turf fights, gang conflict. With regard to women, it tends to be associated with the home, domestic violence, the major cause of homicide deaths of women. Mass shootings, the kind of things that prompt these sorts of conversations, Sandy Hook and all. Here I'll just rely directly on a forthcoming book by Phil Cook, who asks the question, are mass shootings increasing in the United States? And he says maybe. It depends. It turns out there's no canonical definition of what a mass shooting is. It's one problem. They remain relatively rare events in terms of those global figures for gunshot fatalities, and yet when they occur, they get a lion's share of the attention compared to the kind of grinding nature of the other sorts of gun violence problems that we experience. The United States does not hold the record for the worst mass shooting. Norway has that honor when a in 2011, a 32-year-old anti-Islamic extremist killed a total of 75 people in 2 different locations. But we've had some bad events. Sandy Hook, the most recent, Virginia Tech in 2007, where a disturbed individual killed 32 students and teachers. The Aurora, Colorado movie theater incident, which was a particularly notable one for Kate and me because our daughter lives about 2 miles from that theater and attends it sometimes. That's the largest, that holds the first place for the total number of people injured, only 12 shot fatally, but another 58 injured with gunshots. And a lot of these associated with individuals who, after the fact, when you do the after-action reviews, turn out to be people who have come to some level of visibility in one form or another to have had mental problems of one kind or another. In a couple of cases, universities or colleges have noted abnormal behavior. In the Arizona incident, there was some documented evidence of drug abuse along with perhaps some mental instability. So that's a kind of overview of the nature of the and the diversity of the gunshot fatalities and injuries issues that we face in the United States. I want to give each of my co-panelists a chance to flesh out any parts of that that they would like to, and then we're going to turn to discuss 3 different topics. One, the possibility that expanding or improving the background check system would be one constructive approach to these problems. Dealing with addressing some of the mental health issues as another approach. Both of these have had a lot of interest at the state level in addition to the national level, and some of the legislation that I cited earlier goes to both of those aspects of the problem. And then an issue that's sort of over the horizon yet a little bit in terms of its availability, but may potentially become in addition to a set of constructive or common sense approaches, and that's the use of technology, things like smart guns and tagging of ammunition for easy identification of the causes of shootings and so on. But first, let me ask any of the 3 of you, or all of you, if you'd like to add any more to the sort of facts and figures overview of the situation.
I can, yeah, I would, I think what would be useful is just to note that there are an estimated 300 million firearms in private hands in the United States. So that's a very important part of the landscape. That's about 1 firearm in private hands per person living in the country. Maybe roughly 40% of American households have a firearm. Firearm ownership is extremely popular as you know, in some parts of the country. There are more people claim to be involved in shooting sports than play tennis in the United States. All of the momentum in gun policy over the last 20 years has been in the direction of liberalizing access to firearms, whether we're talking about everything since the Brady Law and the assault weapons ban in 93 and 94. Everything since then has been in the other direction. So a majority of states have a right to carry laws, where as long as you don't have some kind of legal impediment like a felony conviction, you have a right to carry a gun in public. Immunity, tort immunity for the gun manufacturers. Congress passed a law allowing people to carry firearms in the national parks. Congress passed a law allowing firearms to be carried on Amtrak trains. There's a law now pending in Congress in order to have a universal right to carry across the country so that anyone who has a license in one state can bring it to another state. Many states have passed laws liberalizing opportunities for students to carry firearms on campus. So, and then of course the Supreme Court decisions declaring a individual right to keep and bear arms. So we have seen we're living in a period of a tidal wave of momentum in the direction of expanding the right to keep and bear arms and of access to weapons. I think it's very interesting that after Sandy Hook, the major consequence of Sandy Hook from a gun control policy is an explosive increase in the number of assault rifles. So if you say, what happened after Sandy Hook? Well, an unprecedented, unbelievable run on assault weapons. And every time that we have a call for any kind of initiatives to restrict firearms, the counter reaction is stronger and more powerful. There were more laws after Sandy Hook liberalizing firearms than there were restricting firearms. So I just think that's a useful setting of the stage.
Right. Liz?
I guess my view is a little bit more optimistic, but I would just
Why
point
would that be?
I just point out that this past year we saw the majority of the Senate vote for comprehensive background checks, like a sweeping legislation that would save lives and that would prevent gun violence. And it was blocked because of Senate rules that require 60 votes, but we would have, this is the first time in 10 years that we've seen something like that. This is, we've made tremendous strides towards people becoming aware of this issue, and I would say a year ago, no one knew what a background check was, and now people understand that, that background checks keep people from buying guns, and that they are limited to gun dealers. And also in the past year, we've seen although that legislation failed in the Senate, we've seen 3 states actually adopt comprehensive background check legislation, bringing the total now up to 16. So I guess I'd just say I don't see it quite as bleakly. And just one other point. Well, Professor Schrader's a summary I think was really good of all the kind of data surrounding this issue. I'll just point out that while gun homicide rates have gone down in recent years, injury rates due to the guns have actually increased. And so there is an argument that to be made that gun violence isn't actually going down, but medical care is getting better. So fewer people are dying from gun wounds, but the number of people getting shot by guns is actually still increasing.
Yeah. 75,000 ER trips for non-fatal gunshots in that same time period that I was reporting on 2010. So there's some evidence trauma centers are doing a great job. Nick?
So all of that was fairly comprehensive. I only have 2 things, I guess, to add, just in terms of the facts on the ground. So one of the things that is also part of the conversation in terms of places where people who are untrustworthy get firearms is that there is an enormous amount of firearms theft that goes on in the United States. And we don't obviously have precisely accurate information about this, but those who are trying to estimate those numbers using surrogate information generate numbers hovering around 1 million guns per year. So as we start to talk about background checks and a variety of other methods that we use to regulate the legitimate market, that is initial sales and even secondary sales, one of the things that looms in the background that we haven't talked about in a lot of detail and that is one of the hardest problems to deal with is the fact of gun theft. The other thing that is out there that is also controversial in terms of the other side of the ledger is that we spent most of the time here, and I suppose we will generally, talking about firearms costs. one of the manifestations of the other side of the ledger, that is the notion that people are expanding rights to firearms, that you see increases in legislation that allows shall issue concealed carry, and that's generally the name it goes by, but will vary by state. One of the things in the background of that phenomenon is the notion that there are, in fact, defensive gun uses that are going on in the U.S. that generate just benefits on the other side of the ledger. And people can test those numbers, and Professor Cook has done good work has done his own study, actually, trying to either duplicate or refute some of the early work of Gary Kleck at Florida State. And perhaps we can talk about that, because I know the idea that there are firearms externalities that are positive is one that is sort of harder to explain. It certainly is a less evocative kind of scenario to say that something didn't happen as a result of someone who had a firearm. And those stories will never compete, I think, with incidents like Sandy Hook. So I think that's ultimately another part of the conversation that we may get to.
Right. Well, let's focus in for a minute, if we can, on the background check issue. I know that's one of the priorities of Mayors Against Illegal Guns is improving the background check, not simply expanding it, but making it work better. So maybe you'd like to lead us off on that, Liz.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say it's our number one priority is in improving the background check system. So since 1968, federal law has prohibited certain categories of dangerous people from having guns. So this is felons, domestic abusers, people with certain types of severe mental illness. Our law has said for the past 40 plus years that these people are too dangerous to buy or to possess guns. And the way that we enforce this law is through background checks. So if you go to a licensed gun dealer, that gun dealer contacts the National Instant Background Check System and runs a check on you and makes sure that you're not prohibited. And the system actually works really well. It's it happened, the background check comes back in 90 seconds. It's actually, since its inception in 1998, it's blocked over 2 million prohibited people from getting guns. So it's successful. It's a great system. The main problem with it is that it does not apply to unlicensed gun sellers. So that means that same buyer can go online onto armslist.com, which is basically a Craigslist but for guns, connect with an anonymous seller and buy a gun without a background check. Or that person can go to a gun show and go to a table that is staffed by an unlicensed gun seller and buy a gun without a background check. And so we have this great law that has identified certain people that are particularly dangerous, and now we've chosen not to enforce it by requiring background checks on all gun sales. Some states have taken steps to close this loophole. Like I mentioned earlier, 16 states actually require background checks on all handgun sales, regardless if you're buying from a dealer or from an unlicensed seller. And those states have, it's kind of amazing the amount of success that we've seen in those states. So we know that in states that have that requirement, there are 38% fewer women who are shot to death by their intimate partners. We know that there are 39% fewer law enforcement officers who are shot and killed with handguns, and there are actually 49% fewer people who commit suicide with guns. And this is while the number of people who commit suicide by other means remains the same. The number of women who are killed by other means remains the same. So we definitely we see that these laws work. They actually save lives, and what law enforcement has told us time and time again, that if you want to reduce gun violence, if you want to save lives, the thing that you have to do is you have to focus on the dangerous people. And that's what background checks does. It says, we already have a law preventing these people from getting guns, let's enforce it. And we've seen states have taken a lot of interest in this, and they're going forward with it, and it's great, and that will continue to happen. Eventually, though, there needs to be a national solution because this really is a national problem. States can have very strong gun laws, but like New York, for example, has very strong gun laws, but 90% of the crime guns that are recovered in New York City come from out of state. So states with great gun laws are actually suffering at the hands of states that are refusing to pass this kind of legislation. So eventually we need to see some kind of federal solution here, and that's what the the federal legislation that we referenced earlier would have done, the Manchin-Toomey Amendment, as you may have read about it, it would have required background checks on all gun sales in commercial settings, like gun shows that take place online or at gun shows or through commercial advertisements. And it would enable a person to transfer a gun to his son or to his daughter or to his grandfather, but it would allow people to transfer guns temporarily for the purposes of hunting and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it would make sure that a stranger couldn't transfer a gun to another stranger without making sure that person wasn't a felon. So that's kind of that's our priority legislation. I was asked to keep it to 2 minutes, so I hope that was about 2 minutes. But that's just kind of a background on what our priority is.
All right. Jim?
Well, so the Brady Law passed in 1993. It was considered a monumental piece of legislation. It took, I think, 7 years to get through the Congress, and we've only had national gun control legislation in those years when both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats and the White House was controlled by the Democrats. So that was true in '68, it was true in '93, and it was true back in the 30s as well. That's led me to predict that after Sandy Hook, we would not have, they wouldn't be able to pass federal gun control legislation. So that's just an observation. I'm not a conservative, so I am a criminologist, and when I consider myself as a hard-headed realist and skeptic, I spent a lot of time looking at the war on drugs. There, we've gotten every piece of wish list legislation that anyone could imagine. Anything that could be thrown at drugs, we've thrown at it. And not only have we thrown it at it, but we have enforced it. And not only have we enforced it, we've spent billions and billions of dollars, and we have assigned about a quarter of our beds in prison to enforcing those laws and against drugs. And many of the people who believe in that just another law will make a difference in the gun area, at the same time say that all of this effort in the drug area has been a waste of time and a waste of money. These kinds of prohibitions and trying to prevent crime where it happens doesn't work. I think my own sense is that having a background check only for the dealers and not for secondary sales is ridiculous. So I'm with you on that. I don't think there's any logic to it. If the person can't purchase a gun without clearing the background check from the dealer, he shouldn't be able to do it by putting an ad in the paper and doing it with a private person. I think that enforcing that will turn out to be difficult. Without a registration system, it will be very difficult to enforce that law. I think it's very naive to think that criminals and people who are actively involved in crime will not be able to get a gun. I mean, this idea that you could prevent highly motivated people from ever obtaining a firearm, just make it too difficult in a regulatory way for them to get a gun in a country that has over 300 million of them in private hands, where 1 million are stolen a year, where we have black markets that right now are providing guns to people who can't buy them, who don't want to buy them through legal means. I just think it's kind of an imaginary story.
Okay. So I think this is probably one of those things that I certainly agree on. I think most people agree on this. And in fact, if you watch the history of the political conversation, even Wayne LaPierre of the NRA, years ago at least, agreed on the idea of universal background checks. The difficulty, though, comes in terms of the details, and this is hard to get to in just the popular culture conversation, but Jim hit on it, and that is the enforcement aspect of this. Most people think requires, at least if you're going to use a command and control structure, requires some kind of registration system, and registration is the third rail in this debate. The reason that registration is the third rail is that you cannot have an effective confiscation system without registration. I know we're not talking about confiscation, but people who are in the middle of this debate will always look at the first reflex of the gun control effort. And the first reflex after Sandy Hook was, again, a kind of ban and confiscation scheme. So supply controls end up infecting the conversation about what we can sensibly do, because as soon as the first effort to introduce a supply control is on the table, then several things happen. People run to the gun stores and buy out everything that they can, and people get their backs up and think, okay, this really is about confiscation. Of course, that's what you ultimately want to do, and that infects the conversation about registration, and the registration conversation leaves us unable to come to at least a command and control version of the background check system. Years ago, I wrote an article arguing that if one simply focused on the incentives that were driving most sellers of firearms in the private market, you could deal with most of this problem without a command and control structure. And I'm using sort of euphemisms here, but think about the scenario where any of you who are not already in the sort of criminal culture, where any of you would be willing to sell a firearm to a private person. Your incentives are different from the buyer's incentives, and there are a variety of ways, I think, to capitalize on the incentives that all of us have, not to have someone knock on our door 3 years from now and say, well, this is a gun that we think you bought from a dealer several years ago. It looks like it was used in a crime. If you think about the scenarios in which you would be willing to sell a firearm as a private party to a stranger, it's probably a very narrow range of scenarios. I think there are ways that we can capitalize on those scenarios, get something very close to the universal background checks that I think most of us would agree are good things. And I would even buy into universal background checks if you could adjust the mechanism in the Senate. That is, there was a version of the Senate bill that I thought was fairly close, and I think this solution is actually one that we can get our hands around, and that the real problem is in the details. That at some point or another, maybe this is some. I mean, I foresee in the next 10 years that we're going to have something like universal background checks.
Yeah. Well, there's more to be said on this topic, but in the interest of time, I do think it's worth spending a little time before we throw it open for questions on these mental health issues. Jim's absolutely right in his representation that of the 109 bills that have passed at the state level since Sandy Hook, the Time study classified 70 of them as loosening regulation, primarily in the area of permits and public carry. Of the 39 that were classified as tightening regulations, the majority of them dealt with one of these two issues, either expanding background checks or adding information to the national database more effectively from the state level so that information is available when a dealer even makes an inquiry into the NICS system. And then doing something with respect to mental health, changing the rules of the game on what psychotherapists or people who are come into contact with an individual who looks like they're suffering from mental difficulty, reporting requirements of various kinds. There's not a clear pattern yet as to how those laws shake out. But these are the two areas, I think, where you've seen some movement at the state level, the background check area and mental health. Mental health is an awful tough issue, so maybe, Jim, you can say some things to sort of frame that.
I'll try. So all of these mass shooters are mentally disturbed people. I mean, almost by definition, you don't go and shoot people at random or you don't know for no reasons. You know, if you're mentally healthy, and in many of these cases, the people take their own lives. In the majority of the cases, they take their own lives. And in the majority of these cases, they don't have a history of hospitalization and so forth. Of course, looking backward, people will say, oh, he always seemed weird, he seemed disturbed. That's true, and of course that's true of many people. We've got a lot of weird and disturbed people. So the 68 law, the Gun Control Act of 68 said you can't purchase a firearm if you are dangerously mentally ill, so just like you can't if you are a convicted felon. But for the convicted felons, we have a whole law enforcement system, and it's all online, and it's a very efficient system where you can check a person by name and birthday. You're not using fingerprints, and determine whether they have a disqualifying felony record. Although that also is over-inclusive, to use the lawyer's terms. It's not the case that every person who's ever been convicted of a felony for the rest of their lives is too irresponsible to own a gun. But in any event, they're on a list. Many of them do get their gun rights back, and that's a whole other story. But we have no such list of people who are too mentally unstable to have a firearm. In fact, we don't know how to define that. Who is too mentally unstable to have a firearm? How would you create such a list, and how would you get people off such a list? I mean, a very large number, millions of people seek mental health treatment and take antidepressants and other kinds of drugs, and have had bouts with depression and so forth. And nobody would think all these people should be on a list, and they would be disqualified from getting firearms. And if you were to put them all on a list of some kind, you would then be inhibiting people from going for treatment. It would be stigmatizing people. So the law, anyway, in 68, narrowed it down and said, well, here's a definition of people who are dangerous and mentally ill, and it is that if you were ever involuntarily committed to a mental hospital, or if you've ever been adjudicated as mentally defective, right, then you would be disqualified. Right? But there still is no master list, and most of the states did not. I mean, very few of the states, if any of the states, create a list of people who have ever been involuntarily committed or adjudicated as mentally defective. So there was no such list. And as the NICS system came into was implemented in starting in 1998, we had the list of felons, but we didn't have any federal list of people who even met that limited definition, which was clearly over-inclusive and under-inclusive, right? So it's over-inclusive because of those people who, for example, have been involuntarily committed. Many of them have been committed because of depression, because of suicide, and but they're not dangerous people, and many of them have gotten better. In any event, the number of people who are involuntarily committed is very small. I mean, most people who are hospitalized are voluntary. And of course, most of the really dangerous people are not involuntarily committed. None of these shooters have been involuntarily committed, and so they wouldn't be on the list. I'm sorry to take time with this, but it's kind of a complicated thing, and I can wrap this up in a few minutes. So in recent years, there was a desire to increase the size of the list, and this came to a head in Congress in 2007 with the NICS Improvement Act. It was Congresswoman Maloney from Long Island said, look, only 10% of the people, even who have been adjudicated as mentally defective or have been involuntary, only 10% are even on the list in the NICS system. We've got to do something more. So eventually they did pass a law there, and it was to give grants, and so it's carrots to states to encourage more report fine. So you try to, and to help them get their list together and computerize these records, because these records exist in hospitals, or maybe they exist in some courts, but nobody is collecting these data. So then what happens is you have a reaction from the mental health community. It's not one voice, but a significant portion of the mental health community opposes this whole idea. They do not want to equate their patients and their clients who are mentally ill with criminals who are too dangerous to be considered reliable citizens. They don't want to be in the job of reporting people to state agencies and having their names go up to Washington and being on a list parallel to a list of felons, right? So they will not cooperate with this. They resist it. They don't want to be a part of it. And my sense, and I haven't done a survey of this, is that is the majority of the mental health community. Many of their organizations have come out with resolutions opposing these steps and so forth. So after this 2007 law, we have had some additional reporting of the people who fall into those very limited categories. So they now have more names in the NICS system in Washington, but it's still very under-inclusive because there's still a lot of weird and scary and dangerous people like Adam Lanza in Connecticut who don't fall into that category. Still very difficult to even imagine what a comprehensive list of mentally unreliable people would look like. And I'm thinking maybe we could have like an anonymous hotline, and we could just call in names to the hotline with the name and the birthday, and my students would certainly call me and to put them on the list. And there are all kinds of due process issues here as well. There's one final point. New York is one of those states that after Sandy Hook took some steps here. It was part of the SAFE Act, that you might remember was passed in the dead of night to be the toughest gun control legislation in the country. It requires mental health professionals to report those patients who they have reason to believe are likely to commit serious harm. But there's no enforcement of this. In fact, the legislation says as long as they're acting in good faith, they are not to be liable criminally or civilly. So it's an encouragement that if you have a patient and the patient you think is likely reasonably to engage in serious harm, you should report them to the county mental health agency. And if they then do their own independent evaluation, and it's hard to know exactly how they would do that, they then report it to the Department of Criminal Justice Services. And the Department of Criminal Justice Services checks to see if that person has a license to carry a gun, because in New York you need a license. In most states you don't need a license to have a gun. But if they do have a license, they then inform the chief law enforcement officer of that jurisdiction. Here we have a person who has a license to carry a gun, but the person is likely to be dangerous, right? And we are abrogating their license. Now, there's another due process question. Can they do that without a hearing? They just say you've lost your license. Well, maybe they can, maybe they can't. It'll be debated in court. Then they could go and call the guy on the phone and say, your therapist has reported you to the Department of Mental Health, and they've reported you to the Department of Criminal Justice Services, and we want you to turn in the gun. And you have a license, so do you have a gun? We don't have, so the guy might say, I don't have a gun, or I lost my gun, or here's a gun, but you've got other guns. I don't know. So that maybe they can get the gun away from him, and maybe they can't. One thing it tells me now is that there should be a kind of Miranda warning when you go and you see your therapist, and the therapist can say to you, no matter what you tell me is confidential, we have doctor-client relationship, unless, you need to know this, if you say anything to me that leads me to think that you might be dangerous or might be likely to commit a harm, I have to report it to the state authorities. Now, knowing that, let's enter into our therapeutic relationship.
A couple of brief comments, if you have them, and they're brief, and then we'll turn it to Alfred to your questions.
So I just start by saying that the percentage of crime that's attributable to the mentally ill is very small. So spending a lot of effort looking into ways to expand the mental health prohibitor might not be the best way to spend our energy if we're looking to reduce gun violence. That said, there have been a number of high-profile shootings that have involved mentally ill people, and the current federal prohibitors, while they may be under-inclusive and over-inclusive, they aren't too bad. If you look at the Virginia Tech shooting back in 2007, the shooter there who killed 32 students and teachers, who committed the worst school shooting in the history of our country, he was prohibited under federal law from possessing a gun. The problem was Virginia didn't submit his record to the database. And I say database instead of list because this isn't a list that anyone can just go and look at. This is a very secure database that has very limited information in it. The only one who sees it is the operator of the database. They just see the name. They tell the dealer the person is prohibited from buying a gun, and that's the total amount of information that's disclosed. The dealer doesn't even know why. So this is not like a publicly available list. This is a very, very secure system. But the Virginia Tech shooter, he had been, a court had decided that had ruled that he was a danger to himself, and he had been, he should have been prohibited from buying a gun. Virginia didn't submit his record, so he walked into a gun store and he bought a couple guns, and then he used them to kill 32 people. So if Virginia had submitted that record, it might have been different. Virginia has since passed a law and become one of the leaders in this country in submitting records to the system. This is the solution. The solution is for us to, again, enforce the current federal prohibitors, the current prohibitors that are out there that say, if you have been judged to be a danger to yourself or others, if you have been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital, you might be too dangerous to have a gun. And states have mechanisms that these people can go through to reinstate their gun rights if they are no longer a danger, and that makes a lot of sense. But as an initial matter, they're prohibited from having a gun, and states that pass laws requiring the submission of these records do much better than states that don't pass laws. So of like the 15 best performing states in terms of submitting these records to the system, I think it's 14 of them have passed laws requiring or authorizing the submission of the records. So again, laws work. They can save lives. They will encourage states to submit records to this database, and could stop the next Virginia Tech shooter.
Okay, so the only thing I want to add to that is sort of the reality that we all know, but we haven't really talked about, and that is that people don't live in isolation. So the Connecticut shooter did not purchase his gun. It was a shared access gun. The Georgia shooting, so there are a variety of the school shootings, and many of the school shootings, with the exception of Columbine, the notable exception of Columbine, involved what we should call and think about as shared access guns. That is, there is a gun in the house. So Jim was talking earlier about the general supposition that we've got about 40% of households in the U.S. Some would say, and depending on whose survey you look at from when, the number gets as high as 50%, and regionally, if you move to the southeast, to the southwest, the numbers get to the point of 70%. gave a talk a couple of years ago when Jim and I were on the same panel, and I said, growing up as a kid, I did not know anyone who did not have a gun. And from I grew up in West Virginia, a place where people were not shooting one another in schools, and lots of trustworthy people still are there with lots of guns. So the places where we find huge gun densities generate for us a way of sort of recognizing that when we're talking about these large sort of prophylactic measures, that you've got to then think about the reality of the way people live. And most of the people who have some sort of mental disability probably live with someone. So now we've got an additional question of, well, what about Dad's gun, or what about Grandpa's gun, or what about the gun that Aunt Mary talks about when she has a couple of drinks and says nobody's going to bother her, or all of these sort of more folksy versions of the reality that many of us have some familiarity with, suggest to us that it's not fruitless to think about creating prohibited categories and working on those categories where we can. But I think we need to be realistic about what we're likely to achieve. And unfortunately, sometimes in the political process, people will oversell these things, and then we wind up disappointed with the results. And I think this is one of those categories.
Okay. Great. So I've cheated you from several minutes of your questions, but we're going to turn to you now. So.
I've heard that most gun owners agree with some sort of background check. But the NRA is this huge wall that has effectively bullied Congress into doing that. Is there any way that we could diffuse them in that regard, get them comfortable? They automatically assume that background checks is the first step towards confiscation.
It depends on the design. You could design a background check system, as I suggested before, that in the enforcement process would be, you'd look at it and you'd say, oh, well, the enforcement there is flimsy. But if you just imagine you had a law that said you cannot sell your gun to a private party without a background check. What if you just said it? And said, then there will be civil penalties if you were caught doing it. But we don't have a way of verifying it. And we could look at that and say, well, my goodness, that's a toothless thing. But if you think about the incentives that I was talking about earlier, no one in this room who is not a criminal would violate that law. And the criminals who are already in possession of firearms are going to violate it anyway. I talked with people when I was doing Senate testimony this time last year about a variety of variations on the background check system that would blunt criticisms of the background check that were rooted in this concern about registration. I think you've got to recognize that the concern about registration is a real thing. People tell lots of stories about, so the Washington, D.C. gun ban that was overturned by D.C. versus Heller was rooted in, was enforceable because of a 1976 registration system. Similar things, measures, Jim has done this in his book and in another article, so maybe he can talk about it. The California, first version of the California assault weapons ban, the New Jersey assault weapons ban, none of those things were possible in terms of implementation, were even viable without a pre-existing registration system. So it's hard to say that the registration concern is not real. The last thing I'll say is that in countries internationally that have attempted registration, we find a defiance rate of about 2 to 1. So work by the International Small Arms Survey in Geneva, Switzerland in 1998 or so, it's a great book, did this work internationally to try and determine how people outside the U.S. with no NRA were responding to either registration schemes or confiscation schemes, and what they found was, on average, those schemes generated 2 illegal guns for every legal one. And in many places that don't have anything like our gun culture, the ratio was far higher. So I think that's another one of the realities we've got to think about, and it's impacted by the number of guns we already have. You don't want to just push a bunch of them into the black market deeply where you've got no control and then skew the incentives for honest people to break the law.
So an under-enforced background check system that's universal is better than a non-existent universal background check system. It will be under-enforced without a registration system. Nobody wants to go to a registration system. And you can count on one hand and have 5 fingers left over the number of people in Congress who want to go near registration. It's a complete third rail. So any system has to be crafted in such a way that it disarms that particular objection, but you can still get some marginal benefit out.
I think it would be
expanding the system.
significant.
Can I just build on that real quick? I would just say that a concern about a national registry is completely unfounded. It's actually, there are 5 different places in federal law that prohibit the creation of a national registry. No one's talking about it.
And Congress would be happy to write 5 more.
It's illegal to do it.
It's
It's not a real concern. It's not a real thing that might happen.
Can I just come in on this?
No.
Okay.
Just so you can answer the next question. How's that? Yep.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is there has been any success with the buyback laws, buyback programs, I should say? And the second one is there any correlation between purchase of guns, particularly illegal guns, you have guns purchased illegally, and the militarization of our police forces?
But I wanted to talk about the background check.
We're just going to have to march on. Time is compressing our ability to...
I'll answer one of those. I recently saw a photograph of some buyback guns that it appeared in a document somebody sent to me. And so what we know is the numbers are always very, very low. So it's a kind of political show. But the other thing was, when I looked at the guns in the photographs, so 2 of them were black powder guns or black powder replica guns from, that replicated some 1876 revolver that I doubt anyone could find the materials to make fire. The others looked like the sort of $45 guns manufactured by companies that actually were driven out of business, and some would say rightly so, before Congress instituted the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Firearms Act. So there were 3 or 4 companies that actually did go out of business before the congressional protection. I think they're a kind of show.
Yeah, they've not been very... And that your militarization...
And the idea of somehow de-arming or disarming the police probably wouldn't be a strong political argument for the mayor's group.
No, I understand that. I just was wondering if there's any study been done on the correlation of purchase of guns, particularly illegal purchase of guns, and the militarization of police forces.
I'm not aware
I've not
of
seen
these
If
that.
I'm a young black man living in an inner city, for example, I worked in Baltimore for a number of years, I would feel like I'm a target. No matter what I do or don't do, like potentially I'm a target. So,
Well, you feel like you're a target right now. I mean, the victimization rate is 16 times as it is for whites, for African Americans right now. So you've got lots more to worry about than the police.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the response is a consequence of a worry about police or in anticipation of fighting police. It's a more complicated story, and I talk about it some in the book.
Yes, he's written the book on this topic.
Negroes and the Gun. Yeah, it's an odd title, but...
So recently, I had a discussion with David Kennedy, who's the director of the Center for Crime Prevention at John Jay, and he mentioned what to me was a staggering statistic, which is that 0.5% of people in New York cause 60 to 75% of all of the homicides. And so he advocated for changing policing strategies from a hotspot method to a hot person method. And also that a lot of these crimes are because of social friction that are really impacted by community norms. And when people close to them advocate against violence and saying, this hurts our community, that this has a really big impact. So I'm curious, these are 2 kind of more ground level grassroots approaches, but how could you, if they really can have such a big impact, how can you turn that into a policy that would really change gun violence?
Yeah, well, that really speaks to police strategies, and the police have really done a good job in rethinking their mission and trying to work on prevention and getting proactive mechanisms in the hot spots is a good idea. Hot persons is a good idea also. So David Kennedy's programs about targeting gang leaders and people who have identified themselves as hardcore criminals, very good idea. When you say 0.5%, we have about 450, incredible, 450 homicides in a city of 8 million people. We have fewer homicides in New York than in all of Chicago. So yeah, 450 people commit that those homicides out of 8 million people. So, I mean, that's a very, very small number, and maybe you could predict in advance by looking at some of the most violent people, people who have identified themselves by being violent in the past and who are not now in prison, and giving closer attention to them. That sounds like very good police work, and maybe an alternative to the idea of trying to pass these webs of regulation. And I always say to my students, you're saying to the to the farmer in Wyoming, we got to have your gun. We've got to tighten up. And he says, why? He said, because they're killing each other in gang wars in Detroit. Don't you see the connection? It'd be better to go to Detroit and work with those gangs, and most of those gang leaders are already cannot legally have a firearm. They already are disqualified because of prior convictions.
I'd just like to say hooray for David Kennedy's book, which I love, and when people get to the end of my book and say, okay, I see that argument, but now what? One of the answers I give is, well, read David Kennedy's book, which is called Don't Shoot, and I forget the subtitle. And then the other thing that I tell them is read Geoffrey Canada's work. So that if you want to think about sort of a holistic approach, it's not just, ultimately I conclude that people like Shelley Parker and Otis McDonald, who were older folks trying to live peacefully in Chicago and Washington, D.C., ought to have a right to a firearm, and that Heller, in that respect, was something that I would applaud. But that's not the end of the story, and part of the story is getting these folks that we're talking about very early on. So Geoffrey Canada's Harlem Children's Zone project, I think, is an extraordinary initiative and the other part of a broader conversation.
So I think these kind of targeted evidence-based strategies that police have done in various parts of the country, there was a very successful effort in Boston.
It's Project Exile. Yeah, this is
that went after gang violence by going to the gangs and telling their leaders that if we find that one of your members has been involved in a shooting, we're going to come down on the whole gang. Had a very strong deterrent effect. So these kinds of law enforcement strategies, and one of the things the President did by executive order of his task, the Department of Justice, to scrub again their gun enforcement strategies to be more place-based and location-defined. So it's a very valuable approach to that kind of gun problem that doesn't have anything to do with adding new layers of regulation, just more effective enforcement of the criminal law. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's my understanding that across Western Europe, and in Australia, for example, that it's difficult, if not impossible, for citizens to buy guns. There are very few guns in the hands of private citizens, and their rate of gun violence is a small fraction of that in the U.S. on a per capita basis. What makes them different than us?
Well, first of all, that's not accurate. There are a lot of guns in Europe. In France, people love their guns. Mostly they have long guns, not handguns, but there are a lot of criminals with guns in France. Even in Germany, there is a lot of gun ownership, and certainly in Scandinavia, there's a lot of gun ownership. So, the picture of a completely disarmed citizenry in Europe is just not the case, and certainly not the case in Australia, and not the case in Canada either. There are a lot of differences between, the Netherlands and the United States. We often compare ourselves to Western Europe, and as a criminologist, I'm always seeing as people like they look at Switzerland and how come we're not like Switzerland? We're much more like Mexico. We're much more like Brazil. We're much more like Jamaica. A lot of our populations are from those places, and they are very violent, very, very violent. The violent rates in Brazil and in Jamaica and Dominican and in Haiti are way higher, way higher than in the United States.
How are we doing on time?
We're just about, we can probably go a few more minutes.
Okay. Right here?
Just
In
want
the
to follow
front.
up. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so we talked a lot about legislation and
how it's going to be difficult to put legislation into place. So I'm looking at the panel to try to provide us who are out here in the audience. I think that probably there's one consensus that I'm hearing is that we don't really want to have a lot of mass shootings. So I think that's something that everybody here can say we don't really want to have. So my question to this panel is, what can we do? We're not going to solve it with legislation. We're not going to solve it with other aspects. You know, we address that the mental health issue is very, very difficult. What can we do? We're all here because we're interested in this topic, and you know, looking at you as leaders in this field, what can we do to try to prevent something like that? And you know, as I experience things, I do live in Connecticut. We've had immediate changes in the lifestyle that we have there. You know, on December 13th, I could walk into my daughter's school. On December 15th, I cannot, and it's getting worse and worse. And it's just something that the generations to come will be living with throughout this country. So just wanted to put that on the table. I know it's a little bit controversial, but wanted to see what can we do to help stop the violence.
So first of all, I'll say that I'm not in consensus that legislation doesn't work. I think it does work, and I think that if we, in places like New York and in Connecticut, where you have pretty strong gun laws, like I said, the issue is that there is no federal gun law right now that actually works to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. There's no background check law. There's no federal trafficking law. So what would you do? You can work to pass legislation on the federal level, and I would actually, I mean, as a plug, encourage you to go to our website, which is demandaction.org. And there's a lot of people who like you want to join together and do things, and there's a lot of room for things to happen. There's a lot of grassroots. There's a lot of grassroots activity all the time, and yeah, I would definitely just encourage you to connect with other people who want to do something. And I think there's a lot of evidence out there that enforceable legislation works, and we've seen it.
We cut our homicide rate in the United States by 50% since 1990. We deserve a round of applause for having 50%. If you had told me in 1990, hey, in the next 20 years, we will cut the homicide rate in this country by 50%, so you're out of your mind. The rate in New York of homicide has been reduced by 75%. We are now at 25% of the homicides that we had in 1990. So let's not, you know, when you probably have this experience too, you get into these discussions, we're in an epidemic. We are now in an epidemic. That seems funny. We're now at 25% of the homicides that we had. So, and you have a lot of these homicides are between gun dealers, gang members, drug dealers. I mean, you have a criminal underclass. I mean, that's the predominant place where there is a lot of violence. So you have a lot of places where there isn't very little violence at all.
Are suicides included among those?
We're talking about homicide.
Yeah.
Suicide, as we heard before, has been about steady. The U.S. is not unusual for suicide. Among the countries of the world, we're slightly below average in rates of suicide. Japan, which has very little homicide, has such staggering numbers of suicide that if you take their violent deaths by adding suicide and homicide together, they far exceed the United States. So, you know, is suicide a gun control problem? Would we have, you know, can we attack suicide through regulation of firearms? You know, we could have a discussion about that. You know, I'm not, you know, I'm skeptical about that. I mean, we're already below average. Could we go to the lowest in the world if we didn't have, I don't know. Accidents, we're at 600 accidents per year, far fewer deaths from accidental deaths from guns than in swimming pools. And also think about the deaths from automobiles. We live with about between 30 and 40,000 automobile deaths a year, and there are no panels, there are no discussions, there are no conferences. We should say 1 million people died from guns. Well, probably more than that died from cars, and there's no journals, there's no discussions, it's not a political issue. People are not wringing their hands.
I'm sorry, just
make cars safer.
One thing here. So 33 people are murdered with guns every single day, and
Not murdered. Oh, murdered, yeah, murdered.
Murdered with guns every single day. And women in this country are 11 times more likely to be killed with a gun than in any other developed country. I argue that there is a reason to talk about this, and there's a reason to try to do something.
So the last point that I would make, just so we're clear, Jim is absolutely right about the decline in the homicide rate. And when I was working on the article that was a precursor to the book, and I talk about this in the book as well, you look at the social scientists who try and evaluate why it is that we've had this decline in the homicide rate, and they are all over the map. Why the decline? Why the decline? So I think it would be a mistake for us to walk away and say, well, let's listen to what a mayor or a police chief or a sociologist says, because there is no consensus. That's the first piece. The last thing that I guess I would just mention, we didn't talk about it today, but it has to be part of the ledger or the ledger process. So Jim mentioned the fact that we don't have panels lamenting deaths from automobiles, and that's because I think because we all sort of take for granted the positive utilities that automobiles provide for us. We use them every day. We haven't had a serious conversation, at least in environments where I talk about this in New York. If I go to other places, people will talk about the utility of firearms and think about it in a way that is foreign to many of us in this room. But one of the things that I think you've got to appreciate is that part of the reason we're divided on this is that there are lots of people in the country who look at these issues of firearms utility versus cost in the same way that everyone in this room looks at costs and benefits when we think about automobiles. And I think that's a cultural phenomenon that we sort of lose track of.
I'd also just point out that we regulate automobiles. Also,
I can drive mine anywhere in the country.
You have to get a license in order to drive it.
Yeah. Nobody's talking about taking my car.
Yeah.
Well, until recently.
To be continued. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I mean, I think some of my quick takeaways are that there really is a lot more room for agreement here, and that differences sometimes are just more about what is going to have a practical impact than about just the basic essence of what we're doing. I think another takeaway I always have is that when we try to just boil down to a quick, very pithy phrase, what it is, someone else's view is on something, we edit out a lot of that intellectual rigor that we all really need to understand, that I think allows us to have more similarity than difference about what will be effective. And it's hard to do that in the press world in which we live, and particularly when the discussion on this issue is really triggered by the kind of events like we see at Sandy Hook. But thank you all very much for coming. In the back of your programs, real quickly, I'll draw your attention to a few other Duke New York events we've got coming up, in addition to some hoops watches. They're not listed here, but look for those on our website. There's some in Westchester as well as in the city. But we have Professor Neil Siegel from the law school coming up. I'm not sure where that's being held, if someone here knows. But he'll be speaking on After DOMA and Prop 8. We have a Duke Alums Engage free community service event coming up in April as well, and then a Duke Women's Forum event coming up, and then in May, another great Duke Forward program at the Museum of Natural History. So look for all of those. Right now, if you just step down 2 doors, we're going to have a reception, and you can then leave your name tags at the table before you head out. But thanks, everyone, for coming out. And thank you. Thank you.